John Basilone was born on November 4th, 1916, in Buffalo, New York, the sixth of 10 children in an Italian-American family. His parents, Salvatore and Theodora Basilone, had immigrated from Italy and settled in Raritan, New Jersey, where John grew up. His father worked as a tailor, and the family lived modestly during the economic challenges of the 1920s. From a young age, Basilone developed a reputation for determination and physical toughness. He attended St. Bernard Parochial School but left formal education after the 8th grade. Like many working-class youths of the period, he sought adventure and a means to contribute financially to his family. In 1934, at the age of 18, Basilone enlisted in the United States Army. He was assigned to the 16th Infantry Regiment and trained at Fort Jay on Governor's Island, New York. The interwar army was small and underfunded, but it provided structure and discipline that suited his temperament. During this time, the United States maintained a limited peacetime military presence, focused largely on colonial and hemispheric defense rather than overseas projection. Basilone's early training emphasized physical conditioning, marksmanship, and field discipline. His aptitude for weapons handling and his endurance during long marches distinguished him among his peers. After completing his initial training, Basilone was deployed to the Philippines, which remained under American control following the Spanish-American War. There he served for approximately 2 years, gaining experience in tropical conditions that would later prove crucial during the Pacific campaigns. The Philippines exposed him to both the harsh realities of overseas service and the camaraderie of military life. It also shaped his respect for non-commissioned officers, whose leadership he would later emulate. Basilone's time in the Army ended in 1937 when his enlistment expired. He returned to civilian life but found the transition difficult. After leaving the Army, Basilone worked various jobs, including as a truck driver. He drove long routes across the country, but the routine did not satisfy him. The discipline and purpose of military life had left a strong impression. He frequently spoke about rejoining the armed forces, seeking a more challenging and active environment. The growing tensions in Europe and Asia during the late 1930s influenced his thinking, and by 1940, with war already raging overseas, he sought to re-enlist, this time in the United States Marine Corps. He chose the Marines specifically for their reputation for toughness and frontline combat. Basilone enlisted in the Marine Corps on July 19, 1940, at Baltimore, Maryland. He completed recruit training at Marine Corps Recruit Depot, Parris Island, South Carolina. Parris Island's training program was rigorous, emphasizing marksmanship, close order drill, and strict adherence to discipline. Basilone's previous Army experience gave him an advantage, and he quickly adapted to the Corps' demanding standards. He qualified as an expert machine gunner, a skill that would define his combat career. The Marines emphasized mastery of the Browning M1917 and M1919 machine guns, both water and air-cooled weapons that required careful maintenance and teamwork. Basilone's proficiency with these weapons would later prove decisive on Guadalcanal. Following recruit training, Basilone was assigned to the 7th Marines, 1st Marine Division. In early 1941, his unit participated in field exercises in Quantico, Virginia, and the Caribbean. The Marine Corps was expanding rapidly in anticipation of war, and these maneuvers focused on amphibious landings and jungle warfare, skills that were still being refined. Basilone's platoon trained extensively in the use of crew-served weapons, learning to coordinate machine gun fire with rifle squads and mortar teams. He developed a reputation as a capable and confident leader, often taking charge of training sessions. His instructors noted his calm under pressure and his ability to instruct less experienced Marines. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the United States entered World War II. The Marine Corps immediately began mobilizing for combat operations in the Pacific. Basilone's unit became part of the 1st Marine Division's initial deployment to the South Pacific, with the mission of halting Japanese expansion. Before departure, the division underwent intensified preparation at New River, North Carolina, later Camp Lejeune. Training included live-fire exercises, amphibious landings, and jungle endurance marches designed to simulate Pacific conditions. Basilone served as a machine gun section leader, responsible for maintaining crew coordination and weapon reliability under field conditions. In May 1942, the division embarked for the Pacific aboard transport ships, sailing through Wellington, New Zealand, where they established a temporary base of operations. Basilone and his men spent weeks acclimating to the environment, repairing equipment, and rehearsing for the planned assault on Guadalcanal. Supplies were limited, and much of the training involved improvisation. The Marines learned to function with minimal resources, using captured Japanese weapons during practice and adapting to local terrain. Basilone's leadership continued to stand out. He focused on ensuring that his machine gunners could operate independently if separated from command. Guadalcanal was the first major American offensive of the Pacific War. The Japanese had begun constructing an airfield on the island that threatened Allied supply routes between the United States, Australia, and New Zealand. Capturing and holding this position became a strategic priority. Basilone's regiment, the 7th Marines, arrived as part of reinforcements following the initial landings in August 1942. Before their deployment to the front lines, the men trained on Espiritu Santo in the New Hebrides, now Vanuatu. The exercises emphasized coordinated defensive tactics, rapid movement of ammunition, and night fighting. Basilone was promoted to sergeant in recognition of his leadership and technical competence. His role involved supervising the placement and operation of heavy machine guns, ensuring fields of fire were interlocked, and maintaining ammunition supply under combat conditions. His unit operated primarily with Browning M1917 water-cooled machine guns, capable of sustained fire if properly managed. Training manuals emphasized the importance of maintaining water supply for cooling, cleaning the recoil mechanism, and coordinating overlapping fields of fire to repel infantry assaults. Basilone enforced these procedures meticulously. Throughout mid-1942, the 7th Marines faced shortages of equipment, ammunition, and food as logistical networks were still developing across the Pacific. Basilone's insistence on readiness and efficiency became a model for his section. He personally inspected each gun, adjusted tripods, and supervised loading drills. Fellow Marines later recalled that he expected precision under pressure and rewarded initiative. These qualities formed the foundation of the discipline that would sustain his crew during the intense fighting ahead. By the time Basilone's unit landed on Guadalcanal in September 1942, the Marines had been holding the island under constant Japanese attack for over a month. The tropical heat, disease, and lack of supplies had worn down many of the defenders. The newly arrived 7th Marines were tasked with reinforcing the defensive perimeter around Henderson Field, the airstrip that was vital to American control of the island. Basilone's machine gun section was assigned to Colonel Lewis B. Chesty Puller's 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, a formation that would soon become central to one of the most intense battles of the campaign. Basilone's experiences before Guadalcanal, his time in the Army, his exposure to tropical service in the Philippines, and his technical mastery of machine guns, prepared him for the conditions he faced. He understood the logistical challenges of maintaining ammunition flow and weapon functionality in humidity and mud. He also recognized the importance of leadership under stress. His men trusted him because he had demonstrated competence and composure during training. The combination of prior service, professional skill, and practical discipline made him an effective combat leader. As the Marines strengthened their positions along the Lunga perimeter, Basilone's section worked to integrate machine gun emplacements with barbed wire and rifle pits. The Japanese attacks were expected to come through the jungle approaches leading to the airfield. Basilone calculated firing lanes, coordinated overlapping fields of fire, and established fallback positions. His technical understanding of defensive deployment reflected both his training and his field experience. The men under his command later credited these preparations with saving their lives when the assaults began. In the months preceding the pivotal battle, Basilone's leadership style became widely recognized within the battalion. He did not rely on rank to command respect, but instead demonstrated competence through action. He regularly carried heavy gun components himself during movements, maintained the same rations as his men, and emphasized mutual accountability. His conduct reflected Marine Corps values of endurance, teamwork, and initiative, principles the Corps had emphasized since its founding, but which were tested severely in the Pacific campaigns. By October 1942, the Marines on Guadalcanal were engaged in continuous defensive operations. Basilone's machine gun section occupied positions along a key sector near the Tanaru River, one of the main approaches to Henderson Field. The Japanese 2nd Division was preparing a massive assault designed to break the perimeter and recapture the airfield. Intelligence reports indicated that the attack could involve thousands of troops, supported by artillery and coordinated night assaults. Basilone's section was part of the front line responsible for holding that ground at all costs. The experiences and discipline Basilone had accumulated up to this point would soon be tested to the extreme. His early years in Raritan had taught him self-reliance. His army service had introduced him to overseas conditions and weapon handling. His Marine training had refined his leadership and technical mastery, and his months of preparation in the Pacific had hardened his unit for the brutal fighting ahead. When the Japanese offensive reached his sector, every aspect of that background would come into play in a battle that defined his legacy. By mid-1942, the United States had shifted from a defensive stance in the Pacific to planning its first major offensive against Japan. The rapid Japanese expansion following the attack on Pearl Harbor had established a perimeter stretching from the Solomon Islands through New Guinea and into the Central Pacific. Among these positions, the island of Guadalcanal held strategic significance due to its location along the sea routes between the United States, Australia, and New Zealand. Control of Guadalcanal would allow whichever side held it to dominate supply and communication lines in the South Pacific. In early July 1942, U.S. reconnaissance flights identified a newly constructed Japanese airfield on the north coast of Guadalcanal. Once operational, the airfield would enable Japan to threaten Allied shipping and potentially isolate Australia from American support. The Joint Chiefs of Staff concluded that immediate action was necessary to prevent completion of the airfield. The operation was codenamed Operation Watchtower, marking the first American amphibious assault of the war. The 1st Marine Division, under Major General Alexander A. Vandegrift, was selected for the mission. The division, numbering roughly 19,000 Marines, had been formed in February 1941 and was composed of 3 infantry regiments, the 1st, 5th, and 7th Marines, along with supporting artillery, engineer, and medical units. The division's primary training before deployment focused on amphibious landings, jungle warfare, and logistics under isolated conditions. The operation required secrecy and coordination between naval and air forces. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher commanded the carrier task force providing air cover, while Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner oversaw the amphibious landings. John Basilone's regiment, the 7th Marines, had initially been stationed in Samoa for garrison duty and base defense. They were brought into the Guadalcanal operation as part of the reinforcements scheduled for later stages of the campaign. Before departure, the 7th Marines conducted final preparations on Espiritu Santo in the New Hebrides, focusing on live fire coordination and perimeter defense tactics. These rehearsals simulated nighttime assaults and emphasized machine gun interlocking fire, methods that would later become critical during the Japanese offensives. The 1st Marine Division began its movement toward the Solomon Islands in late July 1942. The operation involved approximately 75 ships, including transports, destroyers, and cruisers. On August 7, 1942, the Marines launched the assault on Guadalcanal, Tulagi, and nearby islands in the Florida Group. Initial landings met little resistance. Japanese construction personnel and small garrison forces retreated into the jungle as the Marines secured the nearly completed airfield. The captured installation was renamed Henderson Field in honor of Major Lofton R. Henderson, a Marine aviator killed at Midway. Within days, Japanese naval and air forces began counterattacking. On August 8th, Japanese aircraft from Rabaul launched bombing raids against the Marine positions. The following night, Japanese surface ships attacked the Allied fleet off Savo Island, sinking 4 Allied cruisers and forcing Admiral Fletcher to withdraw his carrier support. This left the Marines isolated on Guadalcanal with limited supplies, ammunition, and heavy equipment. The 1st Marine Division now faced the challenge of defending its perimeter with minimal outside support. Basilone's regiment arrived on Guadalcanal in mid-September as part of reinforcements intended to relieve the exhausted 1st and 5th Marines. The 7th Marines were commanded by Colonel Amor L. Sims and were immediately integrated into the defensive network surrounding Henderson Field. The regiment was placed under the tactical control of Colonel Louis B. Chesty Puller's 1st Battalion, whose sector covered the Lunga River area on the island's southern perimeter. This zone was heavily forested, with poor visibility and limited fields of fire, conditions that favored Japanese infiltration tactics. The 7th Marines brought with them heavier weapons, including machine guns, mortars, and artillery pieces, which strengthened the defensive positions. Basilone, now a sergeant, commanded a section of heavy machine guns equipped with the Browning M1917A1 water-cooled weapon. His responsibilities included sighting gun positions, assigning crew duties, maintaining communication with nearby rifle platoons, and ensuring ammunition distribution. Each machine gun required several Marines to operate efficiently: a gunner, an assistant gunner, and ammunition carriers. Basilone's section was tasked with covering a critical portion of the perimeter where a Japanese attack was expected. Throughout September and early October, Japanese forces increased their activity on the island. The Imperial Japanese Army's 2nd Division, commanded by Lieutenant General Masao Maruyama, was transferred from Manchuria to Rabaul and then to Guadalcanal to mount a major offensive. Japanese patrols frequently probed the marine lines, using the dense jungle to conceal movement. The Marines maintained constant vigilance, constructing barbed wire entanglements, clearing limited fields of fire, and setting up listening posts forward of the main defenses. The conditions on Guadalcanal were severe. The climate was hot and humid, with frequent tropical rains that turned the soil to mud. Malaria, dysentery, and skin infections affected nearly every Marine. Supply shortages meant that rations were limited to 2 small meals per day, often consisting of canned meat and hard biscuits. Ammunition was rationed to conserve stocks for major engagements. Despite these hardships, morale within the 7th Marines remained firm. The regiment's arrival boosted the strength of the perimeter, and men like Basilone, who had already experienced tropical conditions during earlier service, provided practical guidance to younger Marines. Japanese commanders underestimated the strength and preparedness of the Marine defenses. Believing that the garrison was lightly equipped, they planned a series of frontal assaults aimed at recapturing Henderson Field. The first large-scale attack occurred along the Iwo River, often referred to as the Battle of the Tenaru, on August 21st, prior to the 7th Marines' arrival. This assault ended in disaster for the Japanese, who suffered heavy losses. However, subsequent reinforcements from the 2nd Division convinced Japanese command that a coordinated offensive could succeed if launched in greater strength. By late October, the Japanese had concentrated over 20,000 troops on Guadalcanal. General Maruyama's plan involved a night attack on the southern sector of the Marine perimeter, where the 7th Marines were positioned. Japanese forces were to move through dense jungle terrain and strike from the west, aiming to overrun the positions guarding the airfield. The Marines anticipated the attack based on captured documents and intercepted radio messages. Preparations intensified. Basilone's company reinforced its gun pits, dug secondary trenches, and stockpiled ammunition in concealed positions. During this buildup, Basilone's leadership became increasingly evident. He coordinated with nearby rifle platoons to ensure that his machine guns supported their lines of fire. He instructed his men in ammunition discipline and gun maintenance, stressing the importance of keeping water in the cooling jackets and cleaning the weapons after every firing period. The crew practiced emergency reloads and barrel changes to maintain continuous fire if one gun jammed. Basilone's efficiency reflected not only his technical mastery, but also his understanding of the interdependence of infantry and heavy weapons in defense. The Marines on Guadalcanal operated under constant air raids and artillery harassment. Japanese bombers from Rabaul regularly attacked Henderson Field, damaging aircraft and supplies. The Marines nicknamed the daily bombardment Tojo Time. Despite the constant threat, Marine engineers managed to keep the airfield operational. Aircraft from the Cactus Air Force, composed of Marine, Navy, and Army Air Force pilots, provided limited but vital air support. Henderson Field became the linchpin of the Allied defense, and its protection was the primary mission of every unit on the island, including Basilone's. In preparation for the expected assault, Colonel Puller organized his battalion's defenses in depth. The first line consisted of rifle companies supported by machine guns and mortars, while the second line included reserve positions to counterattack if the front was breached. Communication lines were established using field telephones and runners. Basilone's section occupied a position near the Lunga Ridge sector, one of the key points leading toward the airfield. His guns were positioned to provide crossfire over the main approach routes, supported by overlapping rifle fire. By October 23rd, Japanese troops had begun their approach through the jungle. Torrential rain slowed their movement and caused delays, but they continued forward despite exhaustion and supply shortages. The Japanese planned to attack in multiple waves, using infiltration tactics and hand-to-hand combat to penetrate the Marine lines. The defenders, aware of the approaching forces, remained on high alert throughout the night as Basilone's men completed final preparations. They received limited resupply due to muddy roads and enemy shelling that disrupted transport. Ammunition was carried forward by hand, often through knee-deep mud. Communication between positions was maintained through runners, as field telephone lines were frequently cut by artillery fire or falling trees. Basilone organized ammunition caches behind each gun pit to reduce exposure during combat. The stage was set for one of the most intense engagements of the Guadalcanal campaign. The Japanese assault would test every aspect of the Marine defense system, from fire coordination to supply endurance. Basilone's section, positioned on a critical stretch of the line, would soon become a focal point of the battle. The broader strategic importance of Guadalcanal meant that this engagement was not merely a local clash. It represented the turning point in the Pacific Ground War. The ability of the Marines to hold Henderson Field would determine whether the United States maintained its offensive momentum or faced a prolonged defensive struggle in the South Pacific. The preparations, the logistical buildup, and the months of hardship had brought the Marines to this moment. Every man in Basilone's section understood the significance of their assignment. Their position anchored part of the defensive network protecting the airfield, and any breach could allow Japanese troops to reach Henderson Field directly. The 7th Marines, hardened by weeks of preparation and constant alert, were ready to meet the assault. For Basilone, the experience, discipline, and training that had defined his service were about to be tested in full-scale combat against an enemy determined to destroy the American foothold on Guadalcanal. By the night of October 24, 1942, the defensive network around Henderson Field was on full alert. Intelligence from patrols and air reconnaissance confirmed that Japanese forces of the 2nd Division had moved into assault positions southwest of the airfield. The Marines of the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, under Lieutenant Colonel Lewis B. Puller, occupied a sector of the line that covered the most likely approach route. Among them, Sergeant John Basilone's heavy machine gun section was positioned along a narrow stretch of jungle terrain that connected two ridges. This corridor, flanked by dense vegetation and intersected by small streams, formed a natural avenue for enemy attack. The Japanese plan, directed by Lieutenant General Masao Maruyama, involved a coordinated night assault with multiple regiments converging on the southern perimeter. The 29th Infantry Regiment, under Colonel Shoji, and the 16th Infantry Regiment, under Colonel Nishiyama, were assigned to strike through the jungle west of the Lunga River, aiming to breach the Marine positions and seize Henderson Field by dawn on October 25th. Approximately 3,000 troops moved forward in heavy rain, burdened by supply shortages and poor communication. The terrain and weather delayed their advance, but by nightfall on the 24th, forward elements began to make contact with Marine outposts. The Marines' defensive layout in this sector consisted of rifle pits, machine gun emplacements, and mortar positions arranged to cover all likely approach routes. Basilone's 2 machine gun squads occupied adjacent gun pits designed to provide overlapping fields of fire. His right flank was supported by riflemen from Company C, while the left flank connected to another machine gun team from Company D. Each weapon had approximately 1,500 rounds of belted ammunition and limited resupply capability. Communications were maintained through field telephones and runners, but constant rain and enemy shelling frequently interrupted lines. At approximately 10 p.m., Japanese mortar fire began falling along the Marine front. The bombardment, though poorly coordinated, marked the beginning of the assault. Soon after, small groups of Japanese infantry began advancing through the jungle, using the darkness and heavy rain for concealment. Marine sentries detected movement and opened fire with flares and small arms. The engagement quickly escalated into a full-scale battle. The Japanese infantry, armed with rifles, light machine guns, and bayonets, charged the Marine lines, shouting their battle cries. Basilone's gun crews opened fire as soon as the first wave entered their field of fire. The Browning M1917, A1 water-cooled machine guns maintained a steady rate of fire, cutting through the dense vegetation and halting the initial assault. Each gun could sustain up to 450 rounds per minute, but continuous firing risked overheating and jamming. Basilone directed his men to alternate barrels and maintain cooling water despite the chaos. Within minutes, the Japanese launched a second and third wave, pushing closer to the Marine lines. The narrow front meant that Basilone's position bore the brunt of the attack. Enemy fire grew intense. Japanese soldiers used hand grenades and light mortars to target the machine gun nests. Shrapnel tore through sandbags, and several crew members were wounded. Basilone moved between his gun positions under heavy fire, coordinating fields of fire and redistributing ammunition. When one of his guns jammed due to a broken feed belt, he cleared the stoppage manually, replaced the belt, and resumed firing. His ability to maintain weapon function under pressure kept the line intact. By midnight, the Japanese had penetrated parts of the outer defenses. Several Marine rifle pits were overrun in hand-to-hand fighting. Basilone's section became partially encircled as enemy troops infiltrated through gaps in the jungle. Despite this, the machine guns continued firing, creating a barrier that prevented the Japanese from advancing toward the airfield. The intensity of the assault forced the Marines to call for illumination flares from the rear position, briefly revealing the extent of the enemy buildup. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers lay dead or wounded in front of the Marine positions, but fresh troops continued to press forward. Ammunition soon became the critical issue. Continuous firing had depleted the initial supply, and several ammunition carriers had been wounded or killed while attempting to resupply under fire. Basilone realized that without immediate replenishment, his section would be forced to cease firing, leaving a gap in the line. Taking initiative, he gathered the remaining ammunition belts, loaded them onto his shoulders, and moved through the enemy-occupied jungle toward the rear supply point. The route was roughly 200 yards through terrain already infiltrated by Japanese soldiers. Despite the danger, Basilone successfully reached the supply dump, gathered additional belts of ammunition, and began the return journey. He navigated through scattered Japanese patrols, using the darkness and confusion to avoid detection. When he reached his position, he distributed the ammunition among his gun crews and immediately resumed coordination of fire. This act ensured that the machine guns remained operational throughout the night and prevented a potential breakthrough. As the battle continued into the early hours of October 25th, the Japanese launched repeated assaults, often in small groups that attempted to crawl through the mud toward the Marine lines. The close-range fighting made coordination difficult. Basilone's gunners alternated between sustained bursts and short, aimed fire to conserve ammunition. When one of his guns was destroyed by enemy mortar fire, Basilone took over a nearby weapon whose crew had been incapacitated, continuing to fire until the immediate threat was repelled. The Japanese attempted several flanking maneuvers to bypass the machine gun positions, but coordination among Marine units prevented any significant breach. Riflemen from adjacent platoons provided supporting fire, and mortars from the rear positions targeted suspected assembly areas. Despite their numerical advantage, the Japanese attack lacked effective artillery and air support due to poor communication and logistical failures. The result was a series of disjointed assaults that met with devastating Marine fire. By dawn, the scale of the battle became evident. Hundreds of Japanese bodies covered the approaches to the Marine perimeter. Survivors attempted to withdraw through the jungle, leaving behind weapons and equipment. The 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, had held their position but suffered considerable casualties. Dozens of Marines were killed or wounded, and many machine guns were damaged beyond repair. Basilone's section alone had fired thousands of rounds during the engagement, maintaining continuous fire throughout the night. When relief units arrived to assess the situation, they found Basilone and his men still at their positions, surrounded by expended shell casings and damaged equipment. Reports from officers on the scene described his actions as decisive in preventing the Japanese from breaking through. His ability to maintain control under pressure, ensure ammunition flow, and operate multiple guns after crew losses directly contributed to the defense's success. The immediate aftermath of the battle revealed the magnitude of the Japanese defeat. Estimates indicated that more than 1,500 enemy soldiers had been killed in front of the Marine lines during the night of October 24th to 25th. The Japanese 2nd Division had suffered catastrophic losses and failed to achieve any significant penetration of the American defenses. This engagement became known as the Battle for Henderson Field, one of the defining clashes of the Guadalcanal campaign. Marine Command credited the victory to the disciplined defensive fire and coordination of the units involved. Colonel Puller commended his men for their endurance under extreme conditions. Reports from the battalion highlighted Basilone's leadership as a critical factor. His actions not only kept his section operational, but also stabilized adjacent positions during moments of crisis. His initiative in resupplying ammunition under fire was specifically noted in the official battle reports submitted by the 7th Marines. Following the engagement, the Marines immediately began to repair their defensive positions in anticipation of renewed attacks. Engineers reinforced gun pits with additional sandbags and logs, and casualties were evacuated to rear medical stations. Ammunition and rations were resupplied from limited stocks at the airfield. Despite exhaustion and heavy losses, the defenders maintained their readiness. Henderson Field itself remained operational, allowing American aircraft to continue providing air cover over the island. Japanese commanders on Guadalcanal attempted to regroup, but faced insurmountable logistical problems. Their supply lines, already stretched across hundreds of miles of ocean, were disrupted by American naval interdiction. Many Japanese soldiers suffered from malnutrition and disease, and their morale deteriorated after the failure of the October offensive. Subsequent attacks against the Marine perimeter were limited in scale and failed to achieve any breakthrough. For the Marines, the defense of Henderson Field confirmed the effectiveness of their training and the strength of their command structure. The ability of small units, such as Basilone's machine gun section, to operate independently under fire demonstrated the adaptability of the Marine Corps' doctrine. The engagement also marked a turning point in the Guadalcanal campaign, as it forced Japan onto the defensive and allowed the United States to maintain its first strategic foothold in the Pacific. Basilone's performance during the siege earned immediate recognition within his regiment. His superiors recommended him for the Medal of Honor, citing his courage, leadership, and decisive action under extreme combat conditions. The formal recommendation documented his movement through enemy lines to obtain ammunition, his direct participation in combat after the loss of his gun crews, and his role in maintaining the integrity of the defense. The battle for Henderson Field ended the Japanese Army's last major attempt to retake the airfield. The outcome ensured that American forces would retain control of the island, securing an essential base for further operations in the Solomon Islands and the broader Pacific campaign. For Basilone, the night-long engagement established his reputation as one of the most effective and courageous Marines of the war. The events of October 24th to 25th demonstrated the critical impact of individual leadership in determining the outcome of large-scale operations. By holding their ground through hours of continuous fighting, the Marines at Henderson Field preserved the strategic advantage that would enable the Allied advance across the Pacific. The siege's outcome was not only a tactical victory, but also a decisive moment in the shift of momentum from Japanese expansion to American initiative. For Sergeant John Basilone, it marked the moment when years of training, experience, and preparation culminated in a single night of sustained combat that defined both his career and his enduring legacy within the United States Marine Corps. The battle for Henderson Field had entered its critical phase by midnight on October 24, 1942. Japanese forces continued to press forward in relentless waves, targeting the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, which held the southern perimeter of the airfield. Sergeant John Basilone's section, positioned along a narrow approach near Lunga Ridge, had already been engaged for hours. The ground was soaked with rain and littered with debris from the previous attacks, and the defensive line was under constant threat of being breached. The intensity of the assault had reduced visibility to a few yards, and coordination between Marine positions depended entirely on shouted commands and the muzzle flashes of their own weapons. Basilone's 2 machine gun squads were positioned on slightly elevated ground that covered a shallow ravine leading toward the Marine line. The Japanese infantry used this depression to move forward under partial cover. The terrain limited fields of fire, forcing the Marines to engage at close range. Basilone continuously adjusted his gun positions, ordering one gun to cover the direct approach while the other swept the flanks. The enemy was less than 75 yards away when the heaviest fighting began. During the first hour of combat, Basilone's men maintained an almost constant rate of fire. Each gun team cycled belts of .30 caliber ammunition through the Browning M1917A1 machine guns, which provided the main defense in their sector. However, the sustained fire caused overheating, and one of the guns jammed when its water cooling jacket was punctured by shrapnel. The assistant gunner was killed while attempting to repair the line, and the crew began to run low on ammunition. Basilone immediately moved forward to assess the damage. Despite heavy enemy fire, he crawled to the disabled weapon, cleared the stoppage, and replaced the damaged feed belt with a functional one taken from a nearby casualty. With the gun operational again, he shifted it to a better angle and resumed fire himself until a replacement crewman arrived. At the same time, he coordinated with the second machine gun to adjust its range and angle, ensuring that both weapons maintained overlapping fields of fire. His rapid assessment prevented the Japanese from exploiting the temporary gap. The Japanese intensified their assault between 1 a.m. and 2 a.m., launching multiple attacks supported by light machine guns and grenades. Several Marine rifle positions to Basilone's left were overrun, and the Japanese attempted to infiltrate through those gaps. Basilone ordered his remaining men to concentrate fire along that axis, personally directing the placement of tracer rounds to mark targets in the darkness. When two of his gunners were wounded, he redistributed their ammunition among the surviving men and took over the firing himself. By this point, the enemy was within grenade range. Japanese soldiers threw fragmentation and concussion grenades toward the Marine line, some landing directly in front of Basilone's position. Shrapnel wounded several crewmen, and ammunition carriers were forced to take cover behind sandbags. The rain continued to fall heavily, complicating visibility and jamming some of the weapons with mud. Basilone used his experience from pre-war training to keep the guns functioning, clearing water from the belts and ensuring barrels were not clogged. As the attack continued, the supply situation became critical. The section had expended most of its prepared ammunition stockpile, and the reserve carriers sent to the rear had not returned. Communication lines had been cut, and the volume of fire prevented movement through the open terrain. Basilone recognized that without additional ammunition, his entire section would be silenced within minutes. He made the decision to go himself. Carrying several empty ammunition belts across his shoulders, Basilone moved out of his position into the dark, enemy-contested area behind the Marine lines. He advanced through jungle paths that were already partially occupied by Japanese infiltrators. He used terrain features and shell holes to stay concealed, often crawling to avoid being spotted by enemy patrols. Along the way, he encountered several wounded Marines and directed them toward safer positions before continuing forward. Reaching the regimental supply dump took nearly half an hour. The path was obstructed by fallen trees and wreckage from earlier shelling. When he arrived, he found the area under sporadic enemy fire, as Japanese mortars continued to target suspected Marine supply points. Basilone quickly loaded ammunition belts and boxes onto his shoulders and began the return journey, retracing his route through the same hazardous terrain. The additional weight and constant threat of enemy contact made progress slow. But he managed to avoid detection by using the sound of gunfire as cover for his movements. Upon returning to his section, Basilone distributed the ammunition among his gunners and immediately resumed coordination of the defense. His timely return allowed the line to maintain continuous fire through the most intense phase of the battle. Without that resupply, the Japanese would likely have broken through the weakened center. His initiative ensured that every gun in his sector remained in action. As the night wore on, the Japanese launched renewed attacks, sometimes crawling within a few yards of the Marine positions. The defenders used a combination of rifle fire, grenades, and short bursts from the machine guns to repel each wave. Basilone moved constantly between gun pits, checking alignment, clearing jams, and maintaining morale among his exhausted men. His section had already lost several crew members, but he continued to keep every functional weapon in operation. Around 3 a.m., a new Japanese assault concentrated directly on Basilone's position. The attackers, estimated at several hundred men, advanced under the cover of darkness and heavy rain. They charged through the open area in front of the marine line, attempting to overrun the gun pits. Basilone's remaining gun opened fire at point-blank range, cutting down the first ranks. When the assistant gunner was killed, Basilone manned the weapon himself, maintaining a steady rate of fire even as enemy soldiers reached the edge of the defensive position. He used the machine gun alternately with his sidearm, switching between them as the Japanese attempted to close in. The engagement continued for several hours without pause. Basilone coordinated with nearby riflemen to establish crossfire and prevent any encirclement. He shouted directions over the noise of battle, ensuring that overlapping fire zones covered every approach. His tactical coordination prevented the Japanese from isolating his position, and despite being nearly surrounded, his section continued to hold. By dawn, on October 25th, the Japanese attacks began to weaken. Their ranks had been decimated by continuous marine fire and artillery support from the rear. Many attackers withdrew into the jungle, leaving behind wounded and dead. Basilone's section had expended nearly all of its ammunition, and several of the guns were damaged beyond repair. His uniform was torn, and his hands were burned from handling overheated barrels, but he remained in command, organizing the remaining men to cover the area until relief arrived. When reinforcements from another company reached his position, they found the ground littered with enemy bodies and shell casings. Basilone and his surviving men had maintained their defense for nearly 36 hours without rest. Of his original crew, only a few remained uninjured. The entire section had held its ground despite multiple direct assaults. Reports compiled immediately after the battle credited Basilone's actions with preventing the collapse of the defensive line. The regimental commander noted that the sector would have been penetrated without his leadership and initiative. His personal movement through enemy-controlled territory to resupply ammunition was recorded as one of the most significant individual acts of the engagement. The after-action reports emphasized not only his courage, but also his technical proficiency in keeping multiple guns operational under constant pressure. For his leadership during the defense, Basilone was nominated for the Medal of Honor. The official citation, issued later, documented his movement through enemy lines, his operation of multiple machine guns after the loss of crew members, and his sustained defense against numerically superior forces. The recognition was not based on a single act of bravery, but on continuous command and technical control throughout a prolonged engagement. The aftermath of the battle showed the extent of the Japanese defeat in Basilone's sector. Over 1,000 enemy soldiers were killed in front of the marine lines during the assault. The Japanese failed to capture any significant position and were forced to retreat southward through the jungle, leaving behind heavy weapons and equipment. For the Marines, the victory at Henderson Field marked the end of large-scale Japanese offensives on Guadalcanal. The success of small unit actions, such as Basilone's, demonstrated the effectiveness of marine fire discipline and the adaptability of non-commissioned officers in combat. After the engagement, Basilone and the survivors of his section were rotated to the rear for brief rest and medical attention. His hands were bandaged due to burns from overheated gun barrels, and he suffered from exhaustion and minor shrapnel injuries. Despite this, he refused evacuation and remained with his unit until the battalion was relieved. The command structure noted his endurance as an example of leadership under combat conditions. The experience of that night established Basilone's reputation across the division. Reports of his conduct circulated among both officers and enlisted men. His initiative, combined with strict adherence to procedure, became a reference point for future training. The lessons from the battle reinforced the importance of individual initiative within the Marine Corps' tactical doctrine, emphasizing that small unit leaders could determine the outcome of large engagements through discipline and decisive action. By the time the Japanese withdrew from Guadalcanal in early 1943, Basilone had become one of the most recognized figures in the 1st Marine Division. His defense at Henderson Field symbolized the determination of the Marine Corps during the early Pacific campaigns. The sustained, close-range engagement, the constant maintenance of weapons under extreme conditions, and his movement through hostile territory to maintain supply lines demonstrated the highest standards of Marine leadership. The events of October 24th to 25th defined Basilone's combat legacy. His leadership transformed a nearly isolated machine gun section into a stable anchor point that held the line against superior numbers. The coordinated defense, technical proficiency, and tactical awareness he displayed under pressure were instrumental in the survival of his unit and the defense of Henderson Field. His stand became one of the most studied small unit engagements in Marine Corps history, illustrating the critical role of trained non-commissioned officers in determining the success of frontline operations during World War II. The battle for Guadalcanal marked a turning point in the Pacific War. And within that campaign, John Basilone's defense at Henderson Field became one of its defining moments. Following the Japanese withdrawal in early 1943, the 1st Marine Division was evacuated to Australia to recuperate from 6 months of continuous fighting, disease, and malnutrition. Basilone, along with the few surviving members of his section, was among those moved to Melbourne for rest and reorganization. By this stage, reports of his conduct had reached the highest levels of the Marine Corps command structure. His superiors compiled detailed accounts of his actions, which were forwarded through the chain of command to Washington. In May 1943, Sergeant Basilone received the official notification that he had been awarded the Medal of Honor, the United States' highest decoration for valor in combat. The citation specifically described his leadership during the defense of Henderson Field and his movement through hostile territory to maintain the supply of ammunition under continuous enemy attack. The Medal of Honor was presented by Major General Alexander A. Vandegrift, Commanding General of the 1st Marine Division and later Commandant of the Marine Corps. The presentation took place during a formal ceremony at the division's camp in Australia. Shortly after receiving the medal, Basilone was ordered to return to the United States for a war bond tour, part of the government's effort to boost public morale and raise funds for the war. His public appearances were widely covered by the press, and he was recognized as one of the most famous enlisted Marines of the conflict. Newspapers described his defense at Guadalcanal in detail, emphasizing the scale of the Japanese attack and his decision to run through enemy lines for ammunition. The Marine Corps, seeking to promote recruitment and maintain morale on the home front, frequently featured Basilone in posters and newsreels. While in the United States, Basilone traveled across multiple states, participating in parades and public events. He met with political figures, military leaders, and members of the public who viewed him as a representative of the Marine Corps' fighting spirit. Despite the attention, Basilone expressed discomfort with being kept away from combat. He repeatedly requested to return to an active unit rather than remain in a promotional role. His requests were initially denied, as the Marine Corps considered him more valuable as a public symbol. During his time stateside, Basilone was stationed at Camp Pendleton, California, where he assisted with training new Marine recruits. He used his combat experience to instruct machine gunners and non-commissioned officers in defensive tactics based on the lessons of Guadalcanal. His practical demonstrations focused on gun placement, overlapping fields of fire, and coordination between infantry and support weapons. Recruits who trained under him later recalled his strict emphasis on discipline and his insistence that combat preparation was the key to survival in the field. In July 1944, after continued requests for reassignment, Basilone's orders were finally approved. He was assigned to Company C, 1st Battalion, 27th Marine Regiment, 5th Marine Division. The unit was then training for Operation Detachment, the planned invasion of Iwo Jima. Basilone had the option to remain in the United States as an instructor or in a ceremonial role, but he chose to return to combat duty. His decision reflected his personal sense of obligation to lead Marines in battle rather than serve as a symbolic figure. In October 1944, while stationed at Camp Pendleton, Basilone married Lena May Riggi, a Marine sergeant serving in the Women's Reserve. The two had met during his stateside duty, and their marriage was officiated in California before his unit began final preparations for deployment. It was his first and only marriage, and the couple spent only a few months together before Basilone's departure for the Pacific. The 5th Marine Division sailed for Iwo Jima in January 1945. The operation was one of the largest amphibious assaults of the war, intended to capture the island's airfields for use in supporting long-range bombing missions against Japan. Japanese defenses on the island were extensive, with underground tunnels, reinforced bunkers, and interlocking fields of fire designed to inflict maximum casualties on the invading force. On February 19, 1945, Basilone landed with the first wave on Red Beach, too near the southwestern shore of Iwo Jima. The terrain was composed of volcanic ash, which made movement difficult and provided little cover. The initial landing was met with heavy artillery and machine gun fire from concealed Japanese positions. Basilone's section, equipped with heavy weapons, was tasked with establishing a beachhead and clearing enemy blockhouses that were obstructing the advance. Within minutes of landing, the assault force suffered severe casualties. Communications were disrupted, and many units were pinned down by enemy fire. Basilone immediately began organizing scattered Marines, directing them to use the terrain's limited depressions for cover and to coordinate suppressive fire against the Japanese positions. Identifying a Japanese blockhouse that dominated the approach, he took charge of a machine gun and led a small assault group to neutralize it. He maneuvered through open ground under direct enemy fire, throwing grenades into firing apertures and directing demolitions to destroy the structure. His group succeeded in silencing the position, enabling the Marines behind him to move forward. As he regrouped his men for the next advance, an enemy mortar round struck nearby, killing Basilone instantly. He was 27 years old. For his actions on Iwo Jima, Basilone was posthumously awarded the Navy Cross, the second highest decoration for valor in the Navy and Marine Corps. The official citation documented his leadership in organizing Marines under heavy fire and leading an assault that cleared a vital Japanese position. His conduct during the first hours of the invasion contributed directly to the success of the 5th Marine Division's advance inland. Basilone was buried in Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors. His widow, Lena Riggi Basilone, received his medals and personal effects. She remained active in Marine Corps veteran activities for the rest of her life and never remarried. Basilone's legacy grew significantly after his death. The Marine Corps incorporated his actions into its training and educational materials as an example of leadership under extreme combat conditions. His combination of technical proficiency, physical endurance, and initiative became a standard for NCO development. The events at Guadalcanal and Iwo Jima were frequently used in lectures on small unit tactics and the role of individual decision-making in battlefield success. In 1949, the U.S. Navy commissioned the destroyer USS Basilone DD 824, named in his honor. The ship served in both the Atlantic and Pacific fleets for decades. participating in Cold War operations and Vietnam deployments before its decommissioning. The naming of the destroyer symbolized the institutional recognition of Basilone's service as representing the highest ideals of the Marine Corps. His hometown of Raritan, New Jersey, maintained an enduring connection to his memory. In 1948, the community held its first John Basilone Parade, an annual event that continues to this day to honor his service and the sacrifices of all Marines. Schools, highways, and military installations across the United States were later named in his memory, reflecting the national significance of his actions. The post-war Marine Corps also used Basilone's example in recruitment and historical materials. His actions were featured in official publications and later dramatized in film and television. These portrayals focused on the factual details of his defense at Guadalcanal and his return to combat at Iwo Jima, presenting him as an enlisted Marine who exemplified duty and selflessness rather than personal fame. Historically, Basilone's case remains significant for the unique distinction of receiving both the Medal of Honor and the Navy Cross for separate actions in two major campaigns. Few service members in American military history have been recognized with both awards. His record illustrates the Marine Corps principle that leadership is based on personal example and direct participation in combat, not solely on rank or position. From a doctrinal standpoint, Basilone's defense at Guadalcanal demonstrated the effectiveness of decentralized command, where small unit leaders operated independently within the larger strategic framework. His initiative in maintaining ammunition supply and gun function under fire became a study in combat logistics at the tactical level. His conduct at Iwo Jima, though brief, reaffirmed his continued adherence to these principles even in the face of near-certain danger. The Marine Corps preserved these lessons in its post-war manuals and leadership programs. His actions were cited in official publications such as Marine Corps Gazette and used in professional military education to illustrate adaptability, courage, and initiative under fire. His name was included among those who influenced the development of small unit infantry tactics during and after World War II. Decades later, Basilone's story continued to resonate as part of the Marine Corps' institutional memory. The Guadalcanal and Iwo Jima campaigns remained central to the Corps' identity, and his conduct served as a tangible link between those formative battles and the traditions carried forward by subsequent generations of Marines. The endurance and resolve he demonstrated became synonymous with the Marine ethos of no better friend, no worse enemy. By the end of World War II, Basilone's reputation had transcended his individual actions. He became a historical symbol of enlisted valor, representing the combat leadership that defined the Marine Corps during the Pacific War. His commitment to return to the front after achieving national fame underscored a core principle of service. That duty outweighed personal comfort or recognition. The historical record of John Basilone's service reflects an unbroken line of professionalism from his pre-war training to his final moments at Iwo Jima. Each stage of his career demonstrated the discipline, initiative, and technical skill that the Marine Corps sought to instill in every Marine. His story stands not as legend or embellishment, but as a factual account of a Marine who performed his duty at the highest possible standard, from Guadalcanal to Iwo Jima.